I don't think it's a bluff. I think if it came down to Crimea, for example, if he loses Crimea, which of course they took back, if he loses it now, he might think that's a total humiliation. There are ways where he could limp back to Moscow just now and still kind of paint it as a victory in some way. But if Crimea goes back to Ukraine, I think that would be the last straw for him. That's something he couldn't, spin as a victory in any way. And I think he would be desperate to keep hold of Crimea. So yes, I don't think it's a bluff. I think if he was desperate enough, then yes, he could do it. And as I said earlier, if he is seen to lose in Ukraine, then surely he loses at home. He loses everything, including his life potentially.
So, Julie, do you think the UK has provided enough information on nuclear war since the start of Russia's invasion on Ukraine?
No, I think the government have done the opposite. I think they're keen to play down the nuclear threat, um, probably because, of course, it could cause panic, but it also might smother public support for the war in Ukraine if the government made it clear that that is one potential outcome of going up against Russia. So I think they have played it down just for those reasons, which I don't think is doing us a. I don't think that's any use to us because they need to give us the reality of it. And pretending that it couldn't escalate into something horrific, that's just it's infantilizing. I think they may as well just be honest with us and say it's a risk, but we are doing plenty to minimize the risk. But I think they're kind of dodging the issue really.
What have Britain's previous preparations for a nuclear Armageddon looked like?
Um, it went through two phases in the Cold War. In the 1960s, there was a public information campaign called Advising the Householder on Protection Against Nuclear Attack. And that was it was comforting almost, even though it was dealing with the most horrific topic, nuclear war. The message in it was similar to the message of the Blitz, which is if you follow these instructions and if you fortify your home and if you don't lose your head, don't panic, if you look after your family, look after your pets, then you will survive. And importantly, the message also was help is coming. Sit tight, stay where you are, be sensible, and if you need to be evacuated, for example, the government will send a bus round and will get you all out of the devastated area into an area of safety. So the message was still quite old-fashioned, certainly a message stemming from World War II, and that is the government will help you. That all changed in the 80s when they released their updated advice, which was called Protect and Survive, and that was very, very bleak. A lot of people ridiculed it because the essential message was you can protect and survive a nuclear war, whereas in reality you probably can't. So it was ridiculed, but beneath that ridicule there was a very, very bleak message, which was no help is coming. You are completely on your own. It's almost Thatcherite, if you like. There's no such thing as society. Don't look to the government to help you. So you've got to fortify your home, gather and stockpile food, water, medicines, etc. Don't look to the authorities for any help. And indeed, that message was laid out so bluntly that it said, if someone dies in your house and help hasn't arrived within a certain number of days, then you've got to wrap the body up and bury it in the garden. So that's just the ultimate gesture of how abandoned the population would be. You even have to bury your own dead. So the message changed hugely. In the 60s, as I say, still the message that, yes, help will come, but by the 80s, that was all gone, and it was a Thatcherite message. You're on your own. Don't look to the government for help.
What do you think the message would look like today then? Do you think it would be a cross between the two? Or do you think that maybe like our politics today are just so polarized that maybe the message wouldn't even come?
That's true, yes. I think, yes, social media would make that even worse. There are obviously tribes on social media who would attack the government no matter what they said. Even if what they were saying was eminently sensible, there would be people on the left who would be obliged to attack it, and vice versa, of course, with the right. So the government would be facing an uphill battle. How do you fight through all that noise to actually convey the message? But as for the message itself, there are two approaches they could take, I think, if they were to release a public information campaign about nuclear war. One would be to be blunt and honest and say this is the reality. If there is a full-scale nuclear war, and you live in a target area, a city, or near to a military base, for example, and that is subject to a direct hit, there is nothing at all that you can do to protect yourself. But of course, that's very blunt and quite terrifying, especially in such a small country, especially in such a small country like Britain, where we have targets around every corner. So a lot of people would find themselves close to a target. So that message of despair would apply to most of us. So the alternative to the blunt honesty would be to say, okay, it's going to be dreadful for some people, but for others, yes, if you want to make an attempt to survive, there are certain things you could do. Now, I think that's useless. I think the only defense against nuclear war is not to have one. I think it's useless to pretend that you can survive one. And even if you could survive it, I don't think you would want to survive it because conditions would be so horrific. Society would probably collapse. But it's human nature, I suppose, to want to try to survive, to want to try and make some kind of effort. So if the government wanted to go down that route, then there are certain practical measures you can take, such as fortifying your home, boarding up the windows to protect it against fallout or even against a blast wave. You can, of course, stockpile food, medicine, water. You can learn first aid and home nursing techniques. So those are the practical measures that you can take, but they will only work if, as I said at the beginning, you're not in a target area. Because if you are, then there is not a thing on this earth that you can do to protect yourself against that.
And it's interesting because I feel like I've started to see on TikTok, or we've seen a lot of celebrities start to buy like their own bunkers in case of nuclear Armageddon or some kind of climate catastrophe that they could live in. But then actually, like, do you really want to survive that kind of disaster? I mean, do
Yeah.
you want to see your family die or have to sit in a bunker for 50 years, however many decades, and just
Yes.
live off of canned food? Is that really
It'd be a
is
terrible
survival worth that
existence.
much?
Yeah. And even if we see a lot of billionaires, for example, who've bought bunker space in New Zealand, we always think of New Zealand or Australia as being relatively safe. Um, but even if you did survive it and you were able to emerge from your bunker with your family and friends with you, there will still be a terrible hangover, a terrible legacy, even if the war was confined to the Northern Hemisphere. Trade, etc. There would be trade would have collapsed. You could probably have famine. There would also be the effect on the climate of a nuclear winter. So there's no way that just by being rich and being in New Zealand that you can avoid all the after effects. You might avoid the immediate effects, the blast, the firestorm, etc. But everything else which comes after it is arguably even worse because then you're dealing with the collapse of society, drastic climate change, starvation, knowing that any friends or family you had in the north have died horribly. My favourite film about nuclear war, the most powerful film, is called Threads. And it's called Threads because it refers to all the threads which connect modern society. And a nuclear war would simply snap all those threads. And the film shows us what happens when all those threads are snapped. And the result is you would not want to live in a world where all those threads had snapped because you're completely on your own. You're at the mercy of those around you who are bigger than you, tougher than you. If you're a weak person, for example, you're totally at the mercy of those who can take what you have, and you can't phone the police or phone the ambulance for help. There is no help, utterly alone. So it would be hellish, I think, to survive a nuclear attack. And that's why we shouldn't ever have one. But when we hope for that, we're of course at the mercy of those men in charge who have their, as they say, fingers on the button.
I wanted to ask you a question about Threads with the release of Mark Zuckerberg's new app. Are you a little bit annoyed that they called it Threads? Because now when people search for your podcast or for the film, it's not going to come up with that. It's going to come up with the new social media site.
That's true, yes. It just shows that the film, it was a huge thing in Britain. It's become a real cult classic in Britain, perhaps less so in America. So maybe the word threads doesn't have the same baggage as it does over here. But certainly when I hear that simple word threads, I shudder because that word means nothing but horror to me.
Yeah. Um, I wanted to ask you a question. Feel free if you're not able to answer this because it's quite complicated. But one of my favorite kind of nuclear Armageddon series is called The 100. There's a nuclear fallout and they go up to space and then they come down hundreds of years later. But then over the time of the show, not to spoil it, it becomes revealed that actually it was an AI that kind of became so developed that it pressed the nuclear button, and then kind of all the countries started nuking each other, and that's how they had the nuclear Armageddon. Are you worried about the role of AI in this kind of space?
I'm worried about the role of technology, certainly. There was a famous incident which happened in the early 80s, known as the man who saved the world, which is when a Russian officer who was working in the early warning system over in Russia, his computer detected an incoming missile attack from America. And of course, the protocol is when they launch at us, we have to launch back at them. That's how nuclear deterrence works. The other side have to know that we will instantly retaliate. So the computer said, here it comes. Here is the massive missile attack. Here is the end of the Soviet Union. And the system dictated that he should have, escalated this up the chain, and we would have, Soviets would have hit the button and responded. But he chose to override the system. He thought, no, this doesn't look right. If it was an attack from America, it would be a massive attack. They wouldn't send, a couple over. They would send everything in the hope of knocking as much as possible of the Soviet missiles out. So he thought, it doesn't look right. I am not going to respond. And by doing that, he arguably averted nuclear war and saved the world. But technology was telling him, this is an attack. You should respond. You should retaliate. Again, looking at the Soviet Union, they had a system during the Cold War. I don't know if it's still active, of course. They're still quite secretive about these things, called the dead hand, which referred to a situation where if America managed to launch a devastating first strike, where all the Soviet leaders, everyone in command and control was knocked out, disabled, etc., the Soviet Union would still be able to respond because the computer would be able to detect that there had been all these nuclear impacts on Soviet soil, and the computer, in the absence of any human, would be able to respond in their place, if you like. So yes, there is certainly cause to be terrified of technology. I'm no expert on AI, but technology itself, even 1980s technology, was putting us at enough risk without throwing other aspects into it.
Would you say that in terms of nuclear war that we're in a more precarious or dangerous situation than we were during the Cold War?
I think we are. I'm a very nervous, anxious, and pessimistic person anyway, but I do think we are. I think there were established rules during the Cold War which East and West knew, and on the whole, we played by. Those rules are all gone now. There's, of course, been massive nuclear proliferation since the end of the Cold War. So it's no longer just a case of East and West both have to play along, recognise the rules. There are now, other players who've entered who don't know those rules or don't feel obliged to play by them. I also think when we look back to the Soviet era, we were kind of afraid of the old grey men who were in charge of the Soviet Union. But at least, if we're looking for something to be glad for, at least those severe old grey men had direct experience of the Second World War. So they knew exactly, in a way that British people couldn't have known and American people couldn't have known, they knew exactly what total war and its horror was, because, of course, with being invaded by the Germans. Whereas now, with younger politicians and with a society in the West who are, maybe I'm just speaking for myself, but I think a bit pampered perhaps. I don't think we've known proper hardship for a long, long time, relatively speaking, of course. So I think we feel perhaps quite distant from the concept of total war. When you think back to the state of Europe in the 40s, it's almost unthinkable that that could happen again. But then why not? Why on earth couldn't it happen again? There's no reason that war should have magically stopped threatening the West just because 1945 passed or 1991 has passed. So I think, yes, things are more dangerous now. The old rules have gone. The old mindset that we must never let this happen again has perhaps gone. And I think altogether we've just got a bit soft and a bit complacent.
Yeah, absolutely. I wanted to kind of talk about Ukraine a little bit. Do you think that the West could have done more at the end of the Cold War to limit the amount of nuclear weapons that Russia had in its arsenal?
We probably couldn't have done anything in particular to force them to limit their nuclear weapons, because it wasn't, even though we think the West, won the Cold War, it wasn't a victory in a conventional sense. It wasn't a victory which allowed the West or NATO to parade into Moscow and say, okay, you now have to do X, Y, Z, comply with these rules, with these limitations. We couldn't lay any laws down to Russia like that. So no, I don't think we could have done any more to force them to limit their nuclear weaponry. Um, what we should have done, and we should be doing still, is asking them to reduce the amount that they have, and we should be doing the same, of course. Reduce the amount of weapons that you have, and more importantly, take them off hair trigger alert, because that's a hangover from the Cold War, where you had to be poised and you were expecting an attack any second out of the blue, and you had to respond within minutes. That mindset is so dangerous because there are still weapons sitting there ready to go, but that same threat, of course, has receded. So if we could reduce our amount of weapons, take them off here, trigger alert, and if both sides could do it, that would be a huge improvement. But of course, it's no longer just two sides. There are other countries now with proliferation. I mean, try getting North Korea on side with any of that. It's hopeless. The thing has just spun far more out of control. So yes, things are definitely more dangerous now, but we couldn't have marched into Moscow after the end of the Cold War and said, we demand that you reduce your missiles, because they would have said, what the hell are you doing here? It's not a military victory. You might have some kind of moral victory because the Soviet Union has collapsed, but it doesn't give you the right to march into our cities and demand that we reduce our stockpile. So no, I'd say no is the answer to that question.
Yeah. How afraid are you of the potential of Putin deploying a tactical nuclear weapon?
I'm very worried about that. The scenario of a madman in Moscow pressing the button, or a madman in Washington pressing the button, and the end of the world happening, that's a Hollywood scenario. It's possible, of course, but I think it's a Hollywood scenario. I don't see that happening in real life, because you would truly have to be mad to do that, and also you would have to have officers and generals around you who were willing to allow this to happen. So I don't fear that scenario. That's for movies. I do fear the scenario which you mentioned of a tactical nuclear device being used, because that would seem, that doesn't carry the whole apocalyptic baggage that the big strategic nukes would have. So I believe Putin could, if he feels desperate or backed into a corner, or if he thinks, I'm going to lose the war in Ukraine, and therefore the domino effect will mean that I lose everything and might end up being, put up against a wall and shot. He might see a tactical bomb to, terrify Kyiv, and by extension terrify us, as a small way of getting us to back off. But the thing with tactical nuclear weapons is, some people are now arguing that you shouldn't even call them tactical nuclear weapons. You should say, no, they are all nuclear weapons. Whether it's a massive strategic nuke or a tiny little tactical one, they're all nuclear weapons, and so they should all be completely and utterly forbidden. Their only use should be to deter nuclear war. So if he uses one, yes, I can see it happening. If he feels desperate and terrified enough, what we would have to hope is that there are generals around him who have a bit more reason, a bit more logic, a bit more knowledge of these things, and who would stop him from giving the order. Whether or not that's possible, I don't know. I don't know how the Russian command and control works, of course, but you would have to hope that people on hand would deter him from doing that. Because once you use one small tactical nuclear weapon, you've broken the nuclear taboo, which is held, of course, as Nagasaki. And once you've used one small one, what's to stop NATO responding with another small one? Then Russia use another one slightly bigger, and then it escalates, and then we do have the Hollywood world-ending scenario. So the way I see it is, it's like a Pandora's box of all the horror of a nuclear war, and a tactical nuclear weapon is the tiny, tiny silver key, tiny and insignificant, but small enough, but sturdy enough to open that box nonetheless. So yes, I fear a tactical nuclear weapon use in Ukraine and what it would lead to through escalation.
I mean, do you think he's just bluffing, though? Because he's been saying this really for the past 18 months, basically, since the war started. He's been saying, I might use I might use a tactical nuke, I might use a tactical nuke, and it's just not happened, no matter how many weapons we've given over. Do you think that he's bluffing, or do you think he really could get to that stage where he just gets so desperate that he might do it?
I don't think it's a bluff. I think if it came down to Crimea, for example, if he loses Crimea, which of course they took back, if he loses it now, he might think that's a total humiliation. there are ways where he could limp back to Moscow just now and still kind of paint it as a victory in some way. But if Crimea goes back to Ukraine, I think that would be the last straw for him. That's something he couldn't, spin as a victory in any way. And I think he would be desperate to keep hold of Crimea. So yes, I don't think it's a bluff. I think if he was desperate enough, then yes, he could do it. And as I said earlier, if he is seen to lose in Ukraine, then surely he loses at home. He loses everything, including his life potentially. So I don't think it's a bluff. I think we need to treat it seriously. And even if Washington and London, etc., are 99% sure it's a bluff, that 1% is still too risky. It's still terrifying. So I would treat it very seriously. Yes, if he sees himself and by extension Russia as being at risk and a risk of humiliation, I can easily see him using a tactical nuke. And once that threshold is crossed, we are in, I think, a terrifying situation.
Yeah, and I believe that the process by which Russia has to launch a nuclear weapon kind of is still from the Cold War days, and they've got the briefcase with the big red button, and I believe that it needs the authorization by the president, Putin, and then two of the generals who currently are Shoigu and Gerasimov, who are basically just in his pocket. They kind of do whatever he says. So really, if Putin wants a nuke to go off, a nuke's going to go off because the people that he's kept around since the start of the Ukraine war have just been people who don't disagree with him. It's just an echo chamber.
It does seem that way. We would have to hope that Prigozhin's recent actions have weakened Putin enough that the generals around him would feel emboldened to step in and say no if he did try to launch one. Um, the whole idea about launch procedures, the Russian briefcase is called the Chiget, and yes, as you say, 3 people need to give their approval, but that's just what it says on paper. In reality, as you say, would they stand up to him? So I would hope now, given that he's been weakened, they would. It's the same in America. In theory, the president can give the order, and that's it. The order gets cascaded down to launch. But there's a famous scenario during the Nixon era where Nixon was drinking a lot and was seen as very unstable. And the gossip is that his defense chiefs had given a quiet word to everyone else, saying, "Look, if he phones you up at 3 a.m., sounding a bit drunk and a bit confused, asking you to nuke everyone, can you please just give us a quick call first?" So even though in theory, yes, one guy can press the button, that might not happen in practice. There would still be hopefully sane, reasonable people around that all-powerful president.
Mm. And so Hamish de Breton Gordon, he's a chemical weapons expert, and he's told Times Radio that Russia actually could use the Zaporizhia nuclear power plant, which there's a lot of worries that could turn into another Chernobyl-type disaster. That actually, instead of launching their own tactical nuke, they could just use it as a tactical nuke. I mean, do you think that could be likely?
Well, there's been a lot of talk on Twitter about are we going to see another Chernobyl? And I'm not an expert on nuclear power, but the nuclear scientist Cheryl Rofer had tweeted even if they did attack the plant, we wouldn't see a second Chernobyl because the plant Zaporizhia is built differently. The nuclear material is better protected, and there is no graphite in this plant, which burned after Chernobyl. So it depends on a whole different range of factors. I'm sure if they blew it up, there would be a radiation spill because, of course, there is nuclear material in there. But I don't know enough about the technical aspects of it to say whether it would have the same effect as a tactical bomb. But certainly, from what experts are saying, it wouldn't be a second Chernobyl because when Chernobyl exploded, the lid, if you like, of the reactor blew off, and it left the reactor almost like an animal with an open mouth, and it's almost as if it was spewing out all the radiation through its open mouth. So this plant is built differently. Obviously, they've learned from what happened in Chernobyl, but whether it would be like the effect of a tactical nuke, I can't say because tactical nukes can be any size you like. Um, but certainly they could use it to spill radiation into the surrounding area. But then the worry, of course, for Russia is where does wind take that radiation? Where does wind take the fallout? Because, of course, Russia is right beside Ukraine, as we know. So if they did that, I don't see why they would, because there's a risk that they will poison their own people. But then you could say, since when has Putin cared about the well-being of his own people?
Yeah. And then the final question I want to ask you, and feel free if you um, don't feel prepared to answer it. But I want to ask about the U.S. election and kind of what could happen if Donald Trump gets back into office as kind of a precarious type of character. He. Do you worry that we could have another situation like Nixon getting drunk and potentially firing a nuclear code, and kind of a little bit like Putin having kind of an echo chamber around him where if he gets back into office and he wanted to end the war, he could just be like, well, okay, I'm just going to press the button.
Mm-hmm.
Do you worry about what could happen if Trump comes back into office?
That does worry me, yes, because he seems, of course, far more sympathetic to Putin, and I think he would want to immediately go back to being, isolationist, to pull America out of any involvement, cut all the support for Ukraine, which would be devastating, of course, because not only does that mean Ukraine would probably go under, but it would embolden Russia. So who's next after Ukraine? Would they go and take Georgia or Moldova? Because the rumor is that he wants to rebuild the Soviet Union, which is ludicrous. Of course, it's ludicrous. But yes, my worry is that Trump would come back. And when I talked about the rules of the Cold War, he's one of the people who don't know the rules. It's not that he would choose to discard them. I get the impression that he's so ignorant of history that he would simply not even know that such rules and protocol around nuclear weapons existed. Because I remember when he first came into power, or when he was campaigning to be president, he said something like, with nuclear weapons, what's the point of having them if we can't use them? And that really, really terrified me. That's probably the worst thing he's ever said. Everyone got worked up about what he said about his approach to women, grabbing women, etc., which was horrible, of course. But the thing that chilled me to the bone was, what's the point of having them if you can't use them? Because the point of having them is that you never use them. They are there to deter. They're not there to be used. And if a man is in charge of America and doesn't understand that or chooses to disregard it, that is terrifying. So I would be very worried about him coming back. But the Democrats don't seem to be putting up much of a fight. It seems they're just going to put Joe Biden up again, and he's too old. I don't think he's fit for the job anymore. So it's up to them to put forward a better candidate to try and keep Trump out. But yes, Trump in America, Putin in Russia is a nightmare scenario, and I think that would be the end for Ukraine if that happened.